In this chapter, we're going to learn how to prevent a critical security issue known as SQL injection. Let's begin by getting an understanding of what it is. Let's first start with a simple example. Here's one of our insert SQL statements, inserting a new subject into the table. Notice that each value we're submitting has a single quote around it. This is required for any string values, and as I mentioned before, it's a good idea to have it for all values. Now, imagine that our menu name that we're going to submit is going to be David's Story. Notice that the string contains a single quote. So when we go to build our SQL query and concatenate everything together, it's going to look like this. Take a moment. Do you see the problem? The single quote in the string is not being treated as data, but instead as part of the SQL syntax. It's signaling to SQL that that's the end of the value. So the first value is David. Now we're probably going to get an error after that because it's expecting a comma to come next, not an S. This example is an innocent mistake that will create a bug. However, a hacker can use this same technique to do a lot of harm. Here's another example using an SQL select statement. This is the kind of query we use on our show, edit, and delete pages when we find an existing subject. We would get the ID from the URL string, and if the ID is 5, then the SQL would look something like this. But now imagine that a hacker comes to the page and changes the URL string so that the value is no longer 5, but instead is a long, complicated string like this. When it gets used to build up that SQL query, it's going to do a lot more than we would expect. Notice that there are semicolons in there. The semicolons allow a new SQL statement to begin. So now it's going to read select all from subjects where ID is nothing, then insert into an admins table username and password that the hacker knows, and then select all from subjects where ID equals 5. Notice that it still selects a subject with ID 5 at the end so that the page doesn't break. But that's not strictly necessary. It actually doesn't matter to the hacker if the page ends up returning an error in the end, as long as their SQL command gets run before that error. This process is called SQL injection. SQL injection is when a hacker is able to execute arbitrary SQL requests. The hacker sends in a carefully crafted string that manipulates the standard SQL syntax and injects their SQL code into ours. That's why it's called injection. They're adding their code into our code. Any SQL queries which use dynamic data values are vulnerable. Here we showed it on an insert statement and on a select statement, but it can be really in any place in our SQL. It can be the where clause or the order by clause. Any place where we're using dynamic data is potentially a vulnerability. It does not matter where the data originates either. It could come from the URL string, from the form submitted data, from cookies or sessions, or even from data that's already stored in the database. SQL injection, or SQLI for short, is the single easiest way for someone to hack your website. There are lots of things to watch out for when you're developing for the web, but this is the big one. It's consistently ranked the #1 security threat by OWASP. That's the Open Web Application Security Project. They rank different security threats, and SQLI is always at the top of the list. Why? Well, for one thing, it's easy for attackers to detect it and to exploit it. Our public website has public-facing pages, and it's constantly getting data from users to give them back customized information. And it gives access to large amounts of important data if they're able to hack it. So there's lots of stuff stored in the database. We rely on those and just keep cramming more and more data in them. That's a treasure trove for hackers. And we typically grant our web applications a high level of access to that database data. And by hacking the web application, it allows the hacker to circumvent all the normal access controls that we might have on that data. Hackers can use SQL injection to bypass the normal username password style logins to get access to areas that they shouldn't. They can also use it to steal data like usernames, passwords, credit cards, personal identifying information. When you hear about large data breaches where thousands of passwords are leaked, often it's the result of SQL injection. And they can alter data. A hacker could change orders or transactions in the database or elevate their permissions to give them more access. Or they could just simply destroy data in order to sabotage a site. Here's a classic example. Imagine that I have that same SQL select statement before, but now the hacker gives us an ID that tells it to drop a table. So the constructed SQL will do exactly that. Notice that there's a dash dash at the end of the hacker string. That's an SQL comment indicator, and it tells SQL to ignore the rest of the line. So the final single quote and closing parenthesis is ignored. This is a common technique hackers use. So now that we understand what SQL injection is, and we know how serious it can be, we need to learn how to protect ourselves from it. We're going to do that in the next movie.